So I'm going to tell you the story of our founders in a nutshell. Try to get it down to about 5 minutes, might run over a minute or two, there's a lot to tell. But our founders, very important people. Okay. Our founders are ultimately responsible for us being here, so they're very important people, good for us to know about. This is not actually the Dr. and Mrs. Flinn version, but this is the Bob and Peggy version. I want you to all have a better appreciation for who they really were as people. And in putting this together, I borrowed heavily from our Red Book, our Flinn Legacy book, which I had the privilege of working on and putting together in the mid-1990s. So let's start with Bob, just a basic life sketch. Bob was born in 1897 in Nova Scotia. He moved to Arizona when he was a baby in 1898, first in Kingman, and then his family moved to Prescott. And this is Prescott at the turn of that century. He went to Prescott High School, graduated there, which is Matt's alma mater many years later. This is his yearbook page from 1917. Ended up joining the Canadian Army and served in World War I in France. After that, went to medical school at Harvard. It's a wonderful picture. You can, whoop, darn it, sorry about that. You can see him there where my cursor is at in the third row on the left side. And then obviously he became one of the top physicians in Phoenix and ended up practicing in Phoenix for over 50 years. Peggy, her name is Irene. Those who knew her well called her Peggy. She was born in 1900 in Massachusetts. She grew up independently wealthy. She was at one point the largest female stockholder in the country of IBM stock. She moved to Phoenix from New York in 1946. And to get to know the Flinns, you really need to know their families, a little bit about where they came from. So this is Bob Flinn's family. You see his father, John, mother, Margaret, two of his siblings. There are actually two siblings that came later. Dr. John Flinn, this is a few years later, as you can tell, was also a prominent physician in Arizona. He practiced for more than 50 years. And one of the things that he's best known for is the tuberculosis sanitarium that he established in Prescott, which became world famous, and people came here from all over the world. It was called PAMSIT-GOF, which basically was the acronym for the whole therapy that was the key to dealing with tuberculosis. So pure air, maximum sunshine, equitable temperature, good accommodations, and food. That was his secret, and people flocked to Prescott from around the world to experience this. Bob ended up marrying a first wife and divorced. He had one son, Jack, who you see here. He lived in Phoenix. He's long since passed away. Also, there's only one descendant of the family that we really know of, a great grandnephew, I believe, Sam Albert, who's with the Junior League of Phoenix and was actually an applicant to the Flinn Brown Fellows program a few years ago.
Junior Achievement.
Oh, what did I say?
Junior League.
Oh, I'm sorry, Junior Achievement. Thank you, Tammy. Slip of the tongue. Okay, and then a little bit about Peggy's family. So this is a very important individual right here, Norman Green, who was her first husband. He was the CFO of IBM back when it was becoming IBM. And that was important because IBM funds really comprised the corpus for the Flinn Foundation in its earliest days. Interestingly, Norvin's great-grandfather was Peter Cooper, who was a major industrialist back in the 1800s. He actually was a designer of the very first steam locomotive. He founded Cooper Union, which was a private college in New York City that still exists today. And he was nominated for president back in the 1800s of the Greenback Party. I don't think they're on the ballot this year. Peggy as well had famous lineage. This is her grandfather, Henry Clay Pierce. He was big into railroads and oil. And he was actually one of the 50 most wealthy individuals in the United States during his day. Peggy also had two daughters with Norvin, and they both grew up and moved out of Arizona. One settled in Florida, one moved to Paris, and they've both since long since passed away as well. So you might wonder, how did Bob and Peggy ever get together? So Norvin and Peggy moved to Arizona in 1946 due to Norvin's poor health. And so he thought that the good weather and sunshine, etc. So they came to Arizona, and Dr. Flinn was Norvin's doctor at the time. Dr. Flinn was the house doctor at the Biltmore. He saw a lot of the visitors and residents there. And that's where Norvin and Peggy settled down. So Bob and Peggy actually started hitting it off, and they got together and became an item. And this was actually with Norvin's blessing. He was in poor health, and he wanted somebody to be there to take care of Peggy when he would ultimately pass away. So he was all for this. So Norvin and Peggy actually divorced in 1952 to kind of make way for Peggy to marry Bob. And then Norvin ended up passing away 3 years later in 1955. And it was at that time that IBM funds really came through to Mrs. Flinn. So as we all know, and as I said before, one of the top docs in Arizona for some 50 years was Dr. Flinn. Started his medical career in Prescott and then quickly moved to Phoenix. He didn't practice in Prescott for very long. Became the chair of the Department of Cardiology at St. Joseph's Hospital just up the street. And he brought many innovations into Arizona, such as the electrocardiograph. He was also responsible for the first pacemaker coming to Arizona. He was also president of the state and county medical societies, and he even had his own radio show on healthcare back in the 1930s on KTAR. A lot of interest that the Flinns had together. Horse racing was one of the key ones. Bob was one of the top horse owners for thoroughbred racing here in Phoenix at Turf Paradise, and also at the big tracks in Southern California. Peggy also was into it. She had her own stable. She preferred to have her own horses. She liked the pretty ones. They tended not to run too well, so her horses ultimately didn't win that much, but she really enjoyed it as well. The Flinns would travel extensively throughout the world. She liked to buy Dr. Flinn Rolls Royces. And this one that you see here, this actually exists today over in the Netherlands. There's a collector over there who somehow ended up with Dr. Flinn's Silver Cloud, which he purchased in 1959. And the Flinns had friends in high places. One of them is Lord Beaverbrook. He's not pictured here or anything, but Dr. Flinn was asked by Lord Beaverbrook, who's a famous industrialist and media giant in England around the 1940s. He would ask Dr. Flinn to come out and visit him for the summer and be his doctor for the summer. And so Dr. Flinn would hop on the Queen Mary and cross the Atlantic to go out and spend time with Lord Beaverbrook, rubbing shoulders with many of the celebrities and big names over in England. And I don't have a picture, but as the story goes, Dr. Flinn also had a mistress, and this continued throughout much of his time with Peggy. And it was not necessarily a big secret, and she even went on trips with the Flinns somehow. I don't know quite how that worked, but that's part of the Flinn allure back in our storyline. So in 1965, Dr. and Mrs. Flinn started the foundation. It was a really good match. Bob was the futurist, he was the visionary. Mrs. Flinn, she was very involved in philanthropy. She was always very generous. She was always very anonymous at the same time. She didn't want any credit for what she did. So they formed the foundation in '65 with a gift of $1 million of stock from IBM. It was just board members at that time, no staff until 1981. And the original, as you can see here, the original focus of the foundation was primarily to benefit the cardiology department at St. Joseph's. And obviously that's changed throughout the years. We'll say that obviously Bob's focus was healthcare. Peggy had an interest in arts and in education, and that obviously played out, but it was at a much later date in the 80s after her passing, when we started funding the arts and introduced the Flinn Scholars Program. So, and it was at around that era, in the late 70s and the early 80s, when Dr. and Mrs. Flinn passed away. That's when their full estate came through to the Flinn Foundation, and overnight became the largest foundation at the time in Arizona. And so we are all collectively living out their legacy today. Just one more fun fact to end on. I found this quite interesting, that there's a well-known university in Montreal, McGill University, happens to have an interesting thread throughout our heritage here. So that's where Dr. John Flinn, Bob's father, that's where he got his MD. Bob Flinn ended up studying there years later. One of Bob Flynn's brothers, Zebed Flinn, ended up becoming a doctor as well, and he got his MD from McGill. Years and years later, Lisa Wilkinson Fannin, who was a longtime board member of ours, who worked at St. Joe's up the street, she also was on staff at McGill. And then, of course, just a few years ago, Tammy's son Gabe played college baseball there at McGill. So we've had that thread running for about 120 years now, and who knows, maybe somebody else will create the next step in the chapter. So that is what I have for you. Would love to hear any questions.
That's terrific.
Thank you.
That's great. I had a question that I know I've always wondered. So I know that Dr. and Mrs. Flinn didn't have kids, but have there ever been any Flinns associated with the Flinn Foundation besides them? I mean, like, you know, after they passed or,
That's right.
or anything?
Yeah, you're right. They did. Dr. and Mrs. Flinn did not have kids between the two of them. And there were, I believe there were a couple of distant relatives, that when Dr. Flinn passed away, that there were small estates set up for. So when the foundation really came into its own, they 2 or 3, something like that, relatives that received an amount of funds. But beyond that, really, for a first generation foundation at that time, very little involvement of the family. The one who I got to know, the only one really prior to Sam Alpert, was Peggy Campbell, who was Dr. Flynn's niece, and she lived in Prescott for many years and has passed away since, and her husband Dewey, who was a pharmacist there. She would come to the Flinn Scholars Recognition Dinner every year, and she loved doing that. And it was her, her one big outing in Phoenix every year at a fancy place that she always looked forward to. And so she would tell stories, and her husband too, about Dr. Flinn back in the day. She passed away a number of years ago, as did her husband. So, but very little family involvement with the foundation, which is pretty unusual.
Yeah, one little fun fact that some of you may know, but Sam Alpert, who Brad referenced, that works at Junior Achievement and is a great nephew, is married to Vanessa Ruiz,
That's
who
right.
was the newscaster and now works at the Cronkite School. And I think during this pandemic, they just welcomed their second child.
Oh,
so,
terrific.
Yeah.
Sam has also been a reviewer for us for the
Oh.
Flinn Scholarship Program. It's been really fun to have him involved in that process.
That's right.
That's great.
Other questions? I think one thing that we're blessed with is because the Flinns did not have children between them, when Dr. Flinn passed, really everything from the family came through the foundation. And a lot of it was donated or given away, or perhaps thrown away, certain stuff. But we ended up with all of their personal collection of photos and journals and memorabilia from throughout the years. It's a fascinating collection. And all their books too. I think we have some probably valuable Arizona history books as well as others. Dr. Flinn was a big reader and had quite an interesting collection. So that's all here in our office. It's kind of fun to poke through.
Brad, I'm curious if her daughters or his son has ever reached, I don't know if you know, but have they ever reached out to the foundation about, having access to those things?
No, yeah, Dr. Flynn's son, Jack, really had no contact with the foundation, kept quite separate from it. Mrs. Flynn's 2 daughters, the same thing. In fact, as I learned, Mrs. Flynn's 2 daughters were quite hurt by the fact that that their mom ended up divorcing and marrying Dr. Flinn. When the author that we hired back in the 90s gave a grant to compile the Flinn Legacy book, he'd reached out to the daughter in Paris who was still alive and wanting to find out more information and interview her and such. And she wanted nothing to do with the foundation at that point. But between him and I think maybe some other efforts that John Murphy had made at the time, she ultimately opened up and did agree and gave a lot of good information that nobody knew about, which was wonderful. And we also had in our collection a lot of personal stuff of hers when she was growing up. And so we offered to mail that to her so that she would have it, because we really didn't need to have that in our foundation collection, and she was appreciative of that. So in a sense, there was a little bit of healing that took place there.
Nice.
So you said that they didn't have staff till the 80s. Who was the very first staff person they hired?
Yeah, 1981, John Murphy was the very first one, brought in from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and he set everything up right from the start. And I think he was out here on a site visit or two for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, got to know, I'm not sure about that storyline, but somehow they got onto John and they really liked him and they brought him in and he set everything up, and he was here for almost 30 years before he retired.